I can replace, in many aspects, a lot of cognitive tasks by AI systems, and that frees up a lot of my staff to do more higher level tasks that are more interesting. There is a risk here that if this is not democratized, that the big private companies are going to effectively own the technology and therefore own the direction that it leads us down. But on the other hand, if it is democratized, that if everyone has their own AI assistant or their own open source model that they can tune, then that obviously leads a lot of open doors for bad actors to take advantage of the tech to bad ends.
I think the scale of disruption is potentially much higher because capabilities and how quickly it's unfolding and how slow we are to react to that, right? Because the people and organizations and the companies that are going to do well in this new age are those who are resilient, who understand the technology and are leaning in, who are training and retraining their people, who are rethinking their system.
Hey everyone, welcome to the AI Canvas, the podcast that explores the impact of generative AI on businesses, the arts, and our everyday lives. I'm your host, David Foster, co-founder of Applied Data Science Partners and author of the book Generative Deep Learning, Teaching Machines to Paint, Write, Compose, and Play. Now, over the coming weeks, we'll be diving deep into fascinating conversations with a diverse range of thought leaders, including musicians, artists, journalists, educators, marketers, lawyers, and those at the cutting edge of this fascinating field. We'll explore their unique insights into the opportunities and potential threats of deploying this technology across industries and how it's going to reshape our world. We have a fascinating conversation ahead of us, so sit back, relax, and let's dive into the world of generative AI right here on the AI Canvas. Welcome back to the AI Canvas podcast. This is the show where we talk about all things generative AI and its impact on society, culture, and business. Now, today we're joined by Nina Schick, who is a world-leading authority on the subject. She's been recently named as one of the top 20 global speakers on generative AI, and she's advised none other than President Joe Biden and other NATO leaders as well. Now, she explores AI's transformational impact, not just from a technological perspective, but also its impact on society and humanity at large. As I said, she's author of the groundbreaking book, Deepfakes, and today we're going to be exploring just about everything there is to do with generative AI and where it's leading. So I can't wait to see where the conversation leads. Nina, welcome.
Hi, David. So good to be with you.
Great. So let me start with asking about you. Where did you first get into AI and generative AI? Was it something like as a child you've always had a passion for? Is it something you've come to later in life? Just tell us a bit about like your upbringing and how you got into this space.
Yeah, so it's definitely not one of those stories where I was like, I was 7 years old and then I wrote my own computer game. So that's to say, I don't have a technical background, right? I grew up, I'm half Nepalese, I'm half German. I grew up kind of in India and Nepal, and I eventually moved to the UK. I was always really interested in politics and geopolitics, in part because of my international upbringing, and I ended up working in my early 20s on some of the kind of most seismic geopolitical issues of the 2010s, the invasion of Crimea and eastern Ukraine by Russia all the way back in 2014, some of the disinformation campaigns around the European elections, the US election in 2016. So I'd become very interested in information integrity, the digital online ecosystem, and basically in technology as a macro trend for society and humanity. And I just thought that AI would become one of the most important geopolitical trends of all. So really my interest in AI stems from my interest in power, society, and ultimately humanity. And my real kind of entry point was at the end of 2017 when I was advising the former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen, and I saw emerging on a on a suspicious area of the internet, these so-called deepfakes. You know, at the time when these new capabilities of AI to generate or create new data started emerging from the AI research community, the first thing that enthusiasts started making was memes and pornography, and that was really where it all started for me. It all started with AI generated pornography, and then I looked for a few years at the potential misuses, but increasingly or also started becoming interested, and I'm still very interested in the huge potential for what I believe now is actually, we can debate about whether it's sentient or not, but undoubtedly some form of machine intelligence to be incorporated into almost every human intelligent and creative activity, and what that means from an economic perspective, but also what that means from a broader societal perspective.
Yeah, super interesting. So your background basically is coming at this not necessarily initially from a technological perspective, but almost as a humanist and as somebody who cares about how humanity develops, and someone who really wants to know, is this technology something that we can't handle as a society, and is it going to get bigger than us quickly? Um, and just breaking that down, like you said, into those initial use cases of whether it's pornography or whether it's other nefarious means of attacking people. But then seeing the flip side of this to all of the optimistic side of AI applications as well, and balancing those. So perhaps could you just tell us a little bit about that journey then, and how you've seen generative AI develop from when you were first writing your book about deepfakes to today? And what are the key differences, would you say, from when you were writing then to if you were to write the same book now? What would you have to cover that perhaps wasn't so relevant back then?
Yeah, great question. So when I wrote the book Deepfakes, I mean, it's interesting because you and I were kind of approaching the topic from our own respective angles around the same time. And this was way before it was, sexy or people were really interested. It was still quite a niche thing. But I was obviously informed by my background in geopolitics and mis and disinformation. So, given that the first kind of use case, and still one of the most malicious use cases of AI or generative AI, was non consensual pornography, my lens was very much, okay, how's this going to impact information integrity? And one of the most compelling things about deep fakes, which I always say are the first viral form of generative AI, is AI's ability to clone people's biometrics, right? This is why we've got so many headlines. This is why now, many years later, or 5 or 6 years later, this continues to be hugely important to the whole entertainment industry. The kind of Hollywood strikes. This is a key component about how, AI can clone people's biometrics, hijack people's identities. It's such an interesting and fascinating story, right? That technology is now sophisticated enough to be able to do that. So I was very much looking at it from a almost a civil liberties issue, understanding that this wouldn't just be a tawdry women's issue in the sense that the first malicious use case was in non-consensual pornography, but of course the ramifications are far broader than this is a woman's issue. What does it mean if anyone can take your voice, your identity, your
Right.
biometrics without your consent? But further to that, also looking at information integrity, because when I wrote my book, my premise was that, okay, AI is going to now be an integral part of all content creation. So when you live in an information ecosystem, or you exist in a digital information ecosystem where the majority of content, and by the way, I was mostly looking at this time at audiovisual content,
Mm.
is AI generated. How do you distinguish what's authentic and what's not, and how this might play out in the context of elections, but also how this could be an emerging cyber risk for businesses. As
Mm-hmm.
soon as I wrote the book, I started going deeper and deeper into this field, which we know at the time hadn't even been coined as generative AI, right? Because some of the really kind of groundbreaking foundational models or foundation models hadn't been released to the public as yet. I
Mm-hmm.
started to understand that it was about much more than just content creation, and that it was actually also about much more than just disinformation. Content and disinformation are one part of a way bigger revolution. And I think that revolution is the capacity or ability for AI now to be plugged into any human creative or intelligent endeavor. So, to really further human knowledge and intelligence in a way that has just simply not been possible before. So, then you start seeing the huge potential upside as well. And a part of that story has been working with startups who are at the cutting edge of developing the technology, who've always been. What's really interesting, perhaps, is 30 years ago, when the internet, I was too young, but I imagine, when the internet was coming about, there was less of an understanding in society about how profound this technology would be and how it would reshape the way we do business, how we
Mhm.
communicate, how it reshape cold, hard geopolitics. But certainly with the kind of AI revolution that's unfolding right now, there isn't that sense of, oh, we're naive and we don't know what the
Mm.
implications could be. People understand. People who are building businesses, governments understand how profound this is. So the companies that I've been working with have always kind of understood that and tried, I think, to anchor their innovation with a keen sense of kind of the ethical implications for society. So it's much more about, now I think my key message is this technology is here. It's very
Yeah.
profound.
Mhm.
It's not going back in the bottle. From an enterprise perspective, this is potentially the biggest game changer you could imagine, because you now have intelligence at your fingerprints at fingertips at the point of decision making.
Yeah.
Uh, but also understanding that there's a kind of a broader societal implication. But I push back against some of the major narratives that have mostly to do with kind of AI death, the
Yeah.
existential end of
Boomers.
AI,
Mhm.
and I kind of reject the premise that it's somehow autonomous and that we have no agency, or that we're not kind of co-creating, because I think for the next few years, certainly it isn't just a plug and play AI as an autonomous agent. It's very much mixed autonomy with human and machine together at the wheel.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Digging into that, a little bit more, feels like to me, at least, that this is a parallel to what happened mechanically for humans during the Industrial Revolution, where suddenly there were these incredible machines that were able to do what humans could do physically, but faster, better, cheaper, and more reliably.
Yeah.
And we almost have a complete parallel now for how this is applying itself across business. In my experience as a co-founder of a consultancy that's doing this, seeing the same light bulb moment for business leaders thinking, I can I can replace in many aspects a lot of cognitive tasks by AI systems, and that frees up a lot of my staff to do more higher level tasks that are more interesting. And I can just see the excitement that must have been felt back in those days when these machines were coming in. And there's also pushback, from a lot of people saying, do we want our society to be driven by machines? What do we do when there is no jobs for us? And all of these questions are re-emerging. And I'm sure the same conversations would have been had, in the Industrial Revolution when those machines were being rolled out. And I wonder if, what's your thoughts on that? Do you sort of see this as being a mechanism for pushing the cost of human thought and cognitive tasks to zero?
It's a great question, and I think that the analogy of the Industrial Revolution is the correct one. But of course, now I think the potential upside is just infinitely greater. Because again, if you think about it as a type of intelligence that can complement human intelligence and actually further human intelligence. And perhaps some of the best examples of this are in medical research, where we
Mhm.
already start to see how, for instance, AI is better than junior doctors at diagnostics, or how these some of the models can be applied to the protein folding structures, which would mean that the work of
Mhm.
an entire PhD can now be, 200 million PhDs can be done in one instance by, a particular model that was developed by DeepMind when it comes to protein structure folding.
Mhm.
So I think the potential upside is infinitely greater, but I also think that when it comes to labor market disruption, the analogy that people often make about, okay, well, technology has always disrupted society and people have always found new jobs, and
Mhm.
this is going to be much the same. Yes, there will be new jobs and new ways in which human activity can be applied, but I also think the scale of disruption is potentially much higher
Mm,
because capabilities and how quickly it's unfolding and how slow we are to react to that, right? Because the people and organizations and the companies that are going to do well in this new age are those who are resilient, who understand the technology and are leaning in, who are training and retraining their people, who are rethinking their systems. And I know from working in policy that we're kind of slow to do that.
yeah.
And I think the impact of that is going to be profoundly felt in the age of AI. So I think some of the key societal questions have much more to do with it isn't, is this going to bring abundance? Is this going to bring economic value? Is this going to bring scientific value? Absolutely. I think some of the more profound questions are, how do we ensure there isn't a digital divide? How do we ensure that there is the best level playing field we can create? How do
Mm,
we ensure it isn't just private institutions or private educational facilities that are uh, rolling this out, and thus, a small group of people or companies or organizations retaining a lot of the economic and ultimately political power that
mm.
knowledge of AI systems and ownership of AI systems will bring.
That's exactly it. It's this digital divide that I think most thinkers in this space are most worried about. That there is a risk here that if this is not democratized, that the big private companies are going to effectively own the technology and therefore own the direction that it leads us down. But on the other hand, if it is democratized, that if everyone has their own AI assistant or their own open source model that they can tune, then that obviously leads a lot of open doors for bad actors to take advantage of the tech to bad ends. And I think, just going back again to that industrial revolution analogy, I think, what you said there about, people must have obviously been extremely worried, even in the industrial revolution, about the impact of the technology. But ultimately, business owners still needed to buy those machines, and that was a large investment up front, and there was a risk. But here, the barrier to entry is so low for
Right.
businesses; they can get started tomorrow by starting to test these technologies out. So I think you're right to say this has the potential to be even more disruptive and even faster. I mean, we've obviously seen the speed of things already being rolled out, than we saw back in those days. Just looking to the future a moment, we've obviously heard a lot in the news about GPT-4V, the new vision model that's now being touted by OpenAI, and we've also heard about DeepMind talking of Gemini and that it's going to be a competitor and multimodal as well, vision and text. Um, where do you see the next few months going? Do you see this as being an arms race for the big tech companies, that they are all gearing up towards, or do you see this as just a small step in the general progression, the march of generative AI?
It is an arms race. And you and I, we've been talking for quite a while now, and we've shared, just our disbelief at how quickly things are accelerating, right? I mean, you
Mm,
literally wrote the book on generative deep learning. And I mean, you've literally documented how the advances, which started, 5, 6 years ago, are just, it was maybe something
mhm,
interesting every few months or every few years to now, you can barely keep on top of developments. And I think one of the most interesting trends has been just how all of big tech has pivoted to make generative AI or these new emerging capabilities of AI. I mean, to a certain extent, the terminology is just semantics, right? AI,
mhm,
generative AI, precision AI, whatever you want to call it, these new capabilities of artificial intelligence, how they've made it a cornerstone of their strategy going forward. And it's
mhm.
happened so quickly
Yeah.
because yes, all of the big tech companies understood that AI was a promising field and they had their various projects going on. But it was really, I would say, in summer last year that the field was blown wide open, first with some of the open source releases of Midjourney and Stable Diffusion,
Mhm,
which led the other big tech companies or AI startups in the space to bring out into the open or take out off rails some of the foundational models they had been building to, ChatGPT. And I mean,
mm,
ChatGPT plays such a pivotal role in this story because there is the world of AI before ChatGPT and after. And after the whole world was introduced to AI in a way that was just it was the biggest thing that could happen to AI in the history of AI, because all of a sudden every single person, whether they were a college student or a medical doctor or your grandma, had heard of ChatGPT, right?
Mm.
And all of the big tech companies, first was Microsoft with OpenAI. We've seen what Amazon is doing. We've seen what Meta is doing. We've seen what Apple is doing. We've seen what OpenAI is doing. We've seen what's happening in the open source community with Hugging Face, have poured billions of dollars of resource into developing foundational models, not just private and closed, but open source as well. And we know the capabilities are improving at an unbelievable rate. So again, some of the narrative around AI, and I think that's because people love to be contrarian. A lot of the
Mm.
narrative has been about, oh, it's going to kill us, and this is very, very dangerous. And you and I push back against that, because we think although it's a risk, it's not. It's actually divorced from reality with regards to what's happening right now, and
Hmm.
actually takes our eye off the ball when you think of some of the actual short-term and medium-term risks. And the second narrative, which I found very interesting because the pendulum's been swinging back the other way, is that, oh, well, AI is a dud. And I think in part that is because, guess what? It isn't just a plug and play option, right? You need to understand how to deploy it in your organization for your use case and figure out
Hmm.
what to do with the training data, which is where you come in, obviously. But it isn't just an autonomous agent. So we've gone from AI is going to kill us all to, oh, this is just a fad, to actually what's really happening is the advances from the cutting edge, from the deep minds, the open AIs, Meta, whatever, Facebook, um, Google, have been
Yeah.
astonishing. And in part, that's because all of these private companies have a near monopoly on the best AI researchers, right? You can't. How much is the starting salary if you know how to build a large language model? There's very few people who know how to do it. The private companies, the big tech companies, have a lot of the talent, and the advances, the exponential rate of advancement has been truly astonishing. And
Mm.
although the emerging capabilities are going to be at the cutting edge of these companies for a while, another thing that you've already remarked upon is how quickly it's democratized. So if multimodal comes out, by in a few months time, maybe by the time our conversation is out, a new supermodel which can do multimodal generation, what is the ecosystem going to look like in 6 months time? I mean, it's truly astonishing.
Yeah, exactly. I'm always amazed. I don't know if you've had this experience as well, but just walking into coffee shops and hearing people's conversations and the
Yeah.
number of times I've heard people mention ChatGPT, just overhearing conversations in the street. Have you had that as well? Or is it just me like overhearing these things because I'm immersed in it every day?
No, no, no. It's absolutely, I was in Nepal. People know about ChatGPT.
Yeah.
I think it was around Christmas last year, Christmas 2022, when everyone went home and all of a sudden everybody had a ChatGPT story, either
Mm.
because their kid was using it to write their homework,
Yeah.
or they had heard about it from a colleague. And in terms of breakthrough technologies having a cultural impact, I
Mm.
mean, I think ChatGPT is right up there, which the stats bear out, right? It was the most popular application of all time within 2 months of its release, 100 million users within 60 days. So again, that ChatGPT moment just had this breakthrough impact for artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I saw a great graphic the other day. Actually, you might have seen it as well from Francois Chollet, who showed that there was a lull over the summer in ChatGPT usage, and people were saying, "Oh, this is the beginning of the end." People are, it's cooling off. People aren't really getting as much out of it. And suddenly there was a spike again around the start of September, and it almost perfectly correlated inversely with Minecraft usage. And people are speculating that the idea is that it's kids basically going back to school who were playing Minecraft over the summer and are now going back to school and again needing ChatGPT. So I think my personal hunch is that one of the biggest impact areas of this tech is going to be on children and education. Like most groundbreaking technology, the internet was the same. That we need to almost be most careful with our youngest in society, because as adults, we can largely understand the risks and we have enough grounding in our life experience to kind of I guess, navigate the dangers. But I feel children are completely at sea in many regards with how they use this tech in their education, in their personal lives, in job applications. Do you see enough guidance in this space at the moment? Because I certainly don't. I think it's really worrying actually to see how this tech isn't really being talked about as something that's going to impact children in the short term, and
Yeah.
going forward maybe impact how they can think, because it's ultimately a replacement for their ideas and their why be innovative if you can just ask ChatGPT. And for me, that's a huge worry, especially as a parent.
I think more broadly as a fellow parent, this online ecosystem we've built over the past 30 years and what it does to children is an area of concern.
Mm-hmm.
Social media, I mean, we're still trying to figure out that one. I mean, I have a young daughter, and when you see the impact of content and being online, the potential negative impact, and how I think I'm not at that age yet because my kids are still quite young, but how you try and mitigate screen time and
Mm-hmm.
get your kids outside, and all of these will continue to be just huge trends for society, right? We built this digital online ecosystem. Now it's going to be this layer of artificial intelligence is going to be plugged into it almost seamlessly, which will give
Exactly.
us capability to do things that were unimaginable before. How's that going to impact kids? I don't have the answers to that, but I am, on the flip side, also really excited about how AI can be used to augment personal learning, right? Because
Yeah.
if you think about, if ChatGPT is just the very nascent earliest iteration of your personal AI assistant, right? And everybody's already thinking about, how do we deploy this in an enterprise context? How do we build our own version of ChatGPT with our own data, structured and unstructured, to get valuable insights at the moment of decision within a business context? But if you take that premise and you say that actually every individual can also have their personal AI assistant, which is actually what newcomers to the space like Inflection, the startup founded by
Mm.
Hoffman and Mustafa Suleiman, are looking at exactly that, right? And I think a lot of the other big tech companies, Meta being one, are also starting to look at more the Microsoft as well, personal assistant space. One of the areas of most promise is learning. If
Yeah.
you can have a personal assistant who can teach you in exactly the way you need to know in order to learn something. For
Mm-hmm.
instance, I just never thought I was very quanty or mathematical. And it was probably that I didn't have a very good teacher who could explain the concepts to me in a way that I understood.
Mm-hmm.
But already now, if I play with ChatGPT, I can figure out things that I thought were beyond my intellectual capabilities. So I kind of push back a little bit on the premise of it's going to stop people from thinking, because that hasn't been my experience at all. It
Mm-hmm.
helps me to think. It helps me in my intellectual process. And I can see why this is a phenomenal tool for personalized education. But again, I think the problem is much more, okay, so let's say we have this potential promise in using individualized assistance for teaching. How do we ensure that children have access to it equally? Is it just going to be private institutions that deploy this, or are we going to start seeing it in the state sector? And then if you don't see it in the state sector, what's the digital divide going to look like if children at private institutions have access to these tools, but children at state institutions don't? But of course, it's nuanced, because on the
Mm.
other hand, again, being half Nepali, I've seen how the democratization of this technology means that ultimately everyone has access to it. It doesn't really matter whether you have access to it in school or not. Young people are going to be fluent in AI in ways that we couldn't even dream about. That's not to say that there won't be risks in this ecosystem, but I think it's a new reality for our kids.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. I couldn't agree more with that sentiment that, whilst there are dangers, that the opportunity far outweighs the potential downsides here. And I think what we need to somehow do, and I don't have the answers to this either, is show children that just in the same way as if you had an amazing, say, older sibling who's a genius, it's much more valuable to learn from them and to use them as a resource for furthering your own knowledge than it is to get them to write the essay for you. And it's almost seeing the AI as just another human in that respect, that we wouldn't, if we had access to all this incredible pool of resource, that we wouldn't just get them to do our work for them, but we would get us to make ourselves a better version of us.
Right.
And instilling that into children, I think, is imperative. Because at the moment, I think that there is a risk, obviously, of the tool being used almost as an essay writer by children. That's the first thing I think that would be reached for.
Yeah.
But I think the smart children will realize that there's a bigger option here. And I can't wait to see what is built in the self-learning, self-assistant space, whether it's from Microsoft or whoever, a big company, or even just startups. I think there's a real opportunity there for someone to really make a big splash, in the same way that something like Duolingo did with their sort of education platform.
Right.
There needs to be something in that space.
And the thing that I am interested in is this same concept of, personalized education being expanded. So this is where you really see upside for individuals, right? It's not only personalized education and learning, which starts from the youngest age, but obviously continues throughout life. But it's the same premise for healthcare. That's fascinating. Being able to have the best doctor in the world, which has the data and information necessary to understand that actually we're moving into an era where averages, or saying, you are a woman, therefore your makeup is thus, or is no longer necessary, right? We can be very individualized, very personalized, and make preventative recommendations based on your personal data. So it's education and healthcare that I think are the most promising areas.
Yeah, I totally agree. We're getting to the end of our time, unfortunately, Nina. It's been a fascinating conversation, but these things always go by too quickly. I just wanted to end with a question that we always typically ask people on the AI Canvas, which is to ask you to map out where you think the next 5 years is going to be. And it's obviously very speculative at this point to ask someone where you think the world will be in 5 years. But could you give us a flavor for what life in 2028 might look like from an AI perspective? What sort of things might we be used to doing that we look back on and think, wow, 5 years ago we weren't able to do this, but now we're doing these amazing things.
So I think AI is going to become a part of everyday life, from being implemented in your work processes to being a kind of personal assistant, maybe similar to the smartphone. It'll be a technology that becomes ubiquitous very, very quickly, and we'll look back and be like, we cannot believe we used to do it that way without kind of AI in the loop. I also don't think that it's going to be an autonomous agent, like you just plug your AI in and tell it to do everything. I think it's going to be human and AI in the loop together. So a mixed autonomy. And then ultimately, I think that we live in perhaps the most interesting times known in human history. That's because of everything that's going on with kind of the limits to our planet when it comes to the environmental challenges, but also the potential that is now emerging for human intelligence and human advancement powered by machines, that mean that we are going through probably the biggest change in the shortest period of time ever known. So the change is exponential. The challenges are big, but the potential that's emerging is also really exciting. And I think that the top line is going to be disruption and change. And inherent in that is going to be a lot of risk, but I think lots of opportunity as well. So the world is probably going to be a very different place.
Yeah, I think that's a very apt way to end the conversation, and an optimistic one as well, which is always great. So Nina, thank you so much for joining us today on the AI Canvas. Wishing you all the best for your future work, and thanks again for joining us.
Thank you for having me.